is 9:30. Are we ready to call the meeting to order? Yes? All right.
Ready.
That accomplishes 1.01. We are starting at 9:30. 1.02 is approval of our December 13 policy committee draft meeting. Anybody have a motion to approve those?
Motion to approve.
Yes, I will second it.
I have to
Oh, yes.
abstain.
All those in favor? Nays? Abstentions?
There we go.
Ms. Allen has abstained. This is her first policy committee meeting. Welcome to the fun.
Thank you. I'm excited.
We are excited to have you.
Yes,
Thank you.
should be.
All right, 1.03, public comment. Do we have any signed up public comment?
Nope.
All right, moving right along.
All right.
1.04, policy 101, organization of the board is back in front of us.
It is indeed. We talked about it last on December 13th, and there were some asks from the panel. So we have incorporated those changes in, if you're looking at the red line copy in purple, we have added a definition of administrative function. This definition is derived from some materials made available by the Attorney General for the state of Maryland. We have added a definition for closed session, and we have added a definition for meeting. If you scroll down, you will see that we have in D2 under officers, in the section where we are discussing the officers election, we have, as request was requested, we modified the first little I from the board shall meet in an administrative function to discuss in advance. We have changed that as the panel requested to an open forum. So that open forum conversation to discuss what, who wants to run and what their purpose for running is. We have, if you scroll down to the next page, page 3.
Stop you since we're on that paragraph, just so we
Absolutely.
get on it right away.
Yeah.
The last line of 2BI,
Mhm.
does that also need to be changed? Because that seems to be contrary to the change we made in the first sentence.
It does. You are correct. No, I missed that. D.
Just want to strike that.
Yeah, that's what I wonder, if we just need to strike it.
Say that again. Sorry.
If you read 2BI, we changed the board shall meet in an open forum called in advance of the public board officer election to ensure that all board members are aware of the election procedures, to address any proposed changes to said procedures and to complete that portion of the election process. I would put a period there and just strike, which is within the scope of the board's administrative function, because it's no longer being handled in administrative function.
Good call.
Yeah, that is what should have
Makes sense.
happened. Yes.
Okay, very good.
And
Sorry about that.
no, that's perfectly fine. So then scrolling down to page 3, at the request of the panel, we removed C2. The board president shall annually designate board members to serve on an advisory committee, and moved that into 3A under advisory committees, that the board president and vice president shall annually designate board members to serve on advisory committee. Ms. Allen?
So I have a question. On CI, the board president shall preside at all meetings, sign authorized or approved contracts and other documents on behalf of the board, or delegate such activities to the superintendent, and perform such other duties as are prescribed by the law or by the board. Did we want to add language here that should talk about how the president's obligation to communicate those actions to the full board?
Yes.
Okay.
I like that.
All right.
Okay. Can certainly add a sentence there that the president will report.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the presiding at the meetings, there's no report to be done, but so you're aware of what
Right.
what documents have been signed off on, or what documents have been delegated to the superintendent to sign? Sure.
So since you mentioned communication in this section under board president, I'm also wondering if we want to include some statement about the board president's responsibilities on communicating to the public or the inquiries that come in to the board email.
Email that
Yeah.
is not right, yeah. that we-
And to either just specify that the board president will respond to email and written communication, or designate something similar to like the designate superintendent or other board members. Because it has become sort of, I think, informally an expectation that the board president is responding to emails that come in to board or board and student and board leadership. I think there's 3 different
There
emails now.
are, yeah.
But it's not specified in this section. And I don't think it has to be the board president, but there has to be, the board president has to set up that expectation.
So while I have absolutely no issue with having a single point of contact, I think that single point of contact often makes things function a lot more smoothly because everyone knows who to talk to. I do want to just raise for your awareness that, it will need to be written in a way to ensure that the rest of the board members don't feel like they then cannot respond.
I was actually gonna bring that up, that it would be a secondary line, that this responsibility does not preclude other board colleagues from responding as individual board members, but whatever language you can put that.
But there is one specific email that only the president receives, the president and the superintendent. So I think is that what you're speaking to?
I'm actually talking about all.
I'm talking about all of them, actually.
Just generally
All right.
like having. an
But there is
expectation
one
around
that's- yeah.
response. Yes.
So the
There is
remainder
a-
of the board is not privileged to
Mhm.
that, yeah. So I don't know if we want to differentiate that and then include what,
Yeah, I don't know how we want to address, I mean, my preference would be that when a board president receives an email directly to themselves only through that vehicle, that their response would CC the board. That would be my preference. That there's no private ongoing conversations between the board president and the public.
So
So I don't know how we would articulate that,
with
or,
the exclusion of maybe personnel matters.
so that is getting very into the weeds in terms
I
of
mean,
the
I almost feel like
process.
that's administrative function type of thing. you know?
That's where I was kind of heading, is that seems
Yeah.
more like, a norm of the board that
Yeah.
you all will set for yourselves each year. And I don't know that that's something that you want or need to put into the
To
policy.
articulate in this policy.
Yeah.
I agree. Because some of this stuff, I talk about this all the time, comes down to general business practice. Like, I harp on this all the time. If you're CC'd on an email, you don't respond. It was not to you.
Right.
But but it gets back to that type of thing.
So do you want to leave the entirety of the email response to setting as part of your board norms, or do you want the broader expectation to be articulated?
I think at least, we could at least say that. I mean, since this does articulate, it is saying C, board president, and we are articulating some responsibilities there. I don't think it would be out of line to articulate that it's the responsibility, it would be the or whatever. We anticipate that the board president will respond to all emails and communications directed toward the board.
Right.
This does not preclude other board members from, however you want to articulate. I don't think we're out of line setting
would be
that,
in agreement
setting that
with-
expectation, right?
Adding that statement, yeah.
Fair. And then anything else expanding off of that, I think each administration that comes in would have to set
Okay.
expectations with their fellow board members.
The expectation of the president to communicate with the board. So I do have a question though. Are there bylaws for the board? Are there bylaws that exist?
That's not a,
There are not a written set of bylaws that, like you would think of in terms of a board of a nonprofit or a corporation. There are, I mean, the policy sets a lot of the expectations that would normally be found in those kinds of corporate documents. The norm setting is where I think where the rest of the quote unquote bylaws, but I don't know that you all put those into writing in any way, or if that's just a conversation that you have. I've not been a part of that discussion, so I can't speak to it.
Well, the 100 series focuses on
It,
the board.
right.
Yeah.
And it sets, I mean, that's where you get all the details on here's how we're going to run our meetings. And here's, I mean, so that whole 100 series would effectively be your bylaws.
What, I guess maybe now my question would be, would it be beneficial to have bylaws that, for the board? And, you know, we set these norms, but I was thinking, is there a way to have these norms presented in a way that's a more formal document?
I can certainly.
Maybe that's something that we need to discuss as a board.
It'd be a big job.
Yeah, I think it's something that the board
Because
would.
there's so much contained within the 100 series in regards to actions of the board. And then what the board norms, I think, attempted to do was to fill in some of the blanks that they felt needed to be.
I do think it's something that the board would have to decide amongst themselves. You know, you as a group need to decide something you want. I can certainly have my team take a look around at other LEAs and see whether other LEAs have a specific set of bylaws that are separate and apart from the policies that govern the operations of the board. And
That'd be a full board action. That's not a policy committee action. That'd be
Right.
a full board action.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to burden you with that. I mean, it is something that I could look into
Okay.
myself. You know, I'm not necessarily looking for, you know, and then we can sort of raise it.
Okay. So unless there's other questions about the board president section, the advisory committee section, we did, you know, in 3A, we did revise that to the board president and vice president shall annually designate board members to serve on advisory committees. That is in keeping with the practice that has been occurring. The next set of purple, maybe it, scrolling down. The next set of purple is down in the student member section. At the discretion of the board officer, the student member can be invited to listening sessions, closed sessions, admin function meeting, and or board retreats. It's just an articulation that you have the ability and the right to allow the student member of the board to come. That student member of the board section may need, you know, a wholesale revision if legislation passes that authorizes or requires the student member to become a voting member. Then we may have to rethink what this looks like. But for now, this is what the policy committee had requested that we incorporate. I think Mr. Rose, you had asked for that. And then there's some purple changes in the related information just for how we're capturing the titles. There's nothing of substance there. So that is 101. If you know, it's up to the panel to decide whether you want to see the changes we've talked about today, or whether with those changes incorporated, you're prepared for this to be presented to the board for a first reading.
I have one more question. So when we talk about the, in this section, advisory committees, would we want to add the number of times that the committees meet? Is that something, does that change? I mean, or is that consistent? You know, I guess I was thinking, you know, if there's a minimum number that each committee, and it's probably already in their policy.
It is. It's actually outlined in it. There's another policy that outlines the meeting structure of committees. I can't remember exactly which policy.
Yeah, I don't remember. I've not focused much of my attention on the 100 series because we've been working on the 300 and 400.
But I'm pretty sure there is a policy that articulates the meetings.
It really depends on the committee as well. So for example, the ethics panel theoretically meets quarterly, but every time we get an advisory opinion request, I'm calling another ethics panel meeting. And so I think we've had like 7 of them. When in theory, since I got here, we should have had maybe 2. The policy committee has added meetings both at the request of the board and because we've realized we needed to meet more to get more done because there's still a lot of work to be done. I don't know how often the CAC meets or what the expectations are. And Ms. McNeish, I'm sure you can speak to that.
Typically monthly.
Um,
Yeah, and there are some that vary. So FLAC, for instance, typically meets 4 times a year, but this year we've added a 5th, like placeholder. It's on the BOE calendar in case because we're in the middle of the project that we might need an additional meeting. So I hesitate to put that in the policy just because I think there's enough flexibility there that we don't necessarily have to go back and revise the policy if we decide the policy committee is going to meet every month, which typically there have been some months that we're off.
Pretty much doing that now.
But now we are, but that
Yeah.
might not always be
Yeah.
the case.
Right.
So
And I'll add that those other, outside of CNI and policy, many of those committees contain members of the community. And we work very hard to work around their schedules and to have some flexibility there to schedule meetings in order to make sure they're able to participate. So I too don't want to put too much structure.
Yeah.
I trust those committees to choose when, how they get their work done.
From my perspective, the important piece is not the number of times they're meeting, but the reporting back that is happening at every board meeting where the committees have an opportunity to say, you know what, here's when we're going to meet, so the public becomes aware, and here's what we accomplished in our last meeting. That to me is really more important information than just being able to say, well, we've met 3 times and or 4 times or 5 times or whatever the number is required.
Well, I guess what I think maybe where I was going was to say that there is a minimum, and I'll let it go. I mean, I was just thinking that, the CAC meets once a month, to make that a defined kind of statement to say that, that's the minimum that they're supposed to meet is once a month. But if it's already, and I'll peruse some of the committee policies, to see if those statements are in there.
yeah, because each one of the committees, at least the community, the ones that have community members participating, have a set of bylaws that so the CAC I know has bylaws, the Family Life Advisory Committee has bylaws, I know CCAC has bylaws. So,
REC has bylaws.
yeah, so.
Okay. All right, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. So do you want to see this again, or do you want me to bring it forward to first reading with the edits we've discussed?
I personally am ready to bring it forward to the full board with the edits that we discussed without.
I don't think they were substantial enough to warrant a delay.
I agree.
All right, so move to board for first reading.
Had a first reading on this policy yet?
We have talked about it a lot here. The last time we were here, I asked if you wanted me to bring it back or take it to first reading. You did ask to bring it back.
Thank you.
No.
Okay. Forbid is policy 200. This was presented at the board for first reading and has been returned to the policy committee for further consideration. Dr. Lebo, would you care to join me? Yes, you do.
Just waiting to make sure you want to be here.
Absolutely.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, policy 200 was presented at the December 13th board meeting. And other than a little bit of format fixing, the real issue was to ensure we were incorporating the lessons from the Crestwood redistricting. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Lebo and allow him to engage in the conversation with you all about what edits the policy committee would like to see. We did not present or bring forward any edits to this meeting. We wanted to hear from the policy committee first.
So we certainly had some notes as a staff of what we heard from the board and the community that night. And to Mr. Joyce's point, wanted to make sure we didn't go in a direction the policy committee was not really wanting us to go down. And so it would be helpful from a staff perspective in particular as we talked about the process, because one of the things we heard from the policy committee when we made the recommended edits was to really focus in on quantitative measures as opposed to some of the previous wording, which had really qualitative and unmeasurable goals associated with it. And so as a staff, how can we pull data to be able to evaluate without sort of really quantitative measurements, but understood how that made the community feel. I think one of the things we heard overwhelming was it appeared that there was a lack of focus on student well-being, which was certainly not the intent of the revisions. And I think we can work on some language in the policy statement in particular that really clarifies that is at the root of everything we do. It is about student well-being, but point taken on how that made the community feel that because there wasn't something called out in the process that it appears that we were taking that away. And that's, again, certainly was not our intent. So would appreciate any insight that the policy committee has really about the process first. And I think unless there's something specific, I think the language in the front end about student well-being, we took a lot of notes there and can sort of measure that. But was there anything in particular on the process that you would like to see us focus on as a staff to bring back to the next policy committee meeting to provide some clarity?
I appreciate that, staff took notice of that and that about the student well-being. I think I take a little bit of a different approach because I think this is a business operations type of thing. And there's an emotional probably cost somewhere along the line for almost every process that's in place here. But, we have to abide by, state capacity rules, right? I mean, we can't continue to have a school 140% over capacity, So I appreciate that. I don't want to discount that or I don't want to dismiss it, but I just feel that, I'm almost sure no matter what decision we make when it comes to redistricting, it's going to cause an emotional turmoil somewhere, And while we can address this in writing in some ways, I think the basic fact is that we have a responsibility to keep these schools at a certain capacity for the good of all students in their learning environments. So.
I agree. And I think, so I will get to your question to Dr. Lebo in terms of the process, but I do think when you're thinking about crafting some language in the policy statement, I agree that that's where we should, be upfront that every decision we're making is guided by the well-being, but there are well-being aspects for students and school communities when we're able to reduce class sizes because we're shifting students. There's the emotional connection that students might have to other students, to their friends, to the school, and there are some things that we give up. Having 36 to 40 students in a classroom and redistricting is really designed to address those capacity things. So however we can balance, I don't know how you say that in the policy statement but overall, these are the things that we have to consider. And I think in terms of the process, one of the things that I feel like we kept hearing as concerns from the community is this balance between an option and the options being presented. And I don't know, I think ultimately when we talked about it here, we felt like it would be a good idea for us to have this dialogue as a board first to see, to explore the option to give some feedback before it goes to the community, and that having one option for them to respond to specifically would allow them and us to have specific, like, we don't like this, can you shift this, rather than I like this in option 1 and I like this in option 2 and 3 is. So I don't know how we address that concern, but I do feel like that's something that we've heard a lot from the community feedback, that they, well, one, that they didn't feel like we followed the process before in terms of having options initially in the Crestwood process. But so I don't know if you and your team have given any additional thought to the option versus options
And
in the process.
so we struggle with this a little bit because, again, trying to be responsive to the comments we heard both from the board and the community. And this, I apologize if this is not as articulate as I sort of have been trying to process this. There was a bit of, staff was a little perplexed with the notion that taking an option to the community somehow prohibited future changes.
Yeah.
And I think, I know Mr. Rose and I talked about this. So having done this, unfortunately, we had to do this a lot over the last 7 years. It's a result of the growth, and it's going to continue. This is not going to stop. We had more viable options at the end of the Crestwood area redistricting than we did in any of the previous redistrictings that we did. And the other ones, at times, we did take 2 options as an example at the beginning. And from a staff lens, we got more rich feedback from the community because there was a single focus. What don't you like about this, right? So, and I can think back to multiple meetings. There were some really good community feedback sessions where, have you considered this particular block, right? Why can't we consider keeping this here? And this was frankly from people who didn't live in any of the planning blocks, which is really helpful because they don't have a necessarily vested interest in that move. If you kept this block here and you moved this block, what would that do to transportation? It really allowed staff to be able to go back and say, well, what does that look like? And again, I shared this previously, sometimes I would say the majority of comments in previous redistricting was simply, I like option A or option B. And that's what we were really trying to avoid. So I guess from a staff lens, we're not opposed to having a conversation, and certainly if it's the will of the board, we can develop multiple options, but it is difficult to get really actionable feedback from our experience, again, over the last 7 years that we've done this multiple times. This was the most rich feedback that we received because it was not narrowed in what we were willing to do, but this is the plan. Now talk to us about what we can shift as opposed to an A or a B. And so I don't know if that's language or if that's in how we communicate that. I know, Ms. Gallery, you talked a lot about the communication process, and certainly we agree with that. So I feel like that's a non-answer to your question, but that's really where staff landed.
Not being as well versed as Dr. Lebo in the process of redistricting, is there a space for receiving public input on priority setting before the option is developed?
That's more or less, I think, outlined here in 3C, is that there isn't a plan. That's my understanding, is that there's no plan developed yet. The following initial data collection, school system staff will engage school communities. There's no option yet.
Correct.
We're just data gathering. So that's my understanding, is that within here.
But maybe we need to make that more clear, that data gathering is happening before the options before any option is prepared. And that way it will increase the visibility of, we are engaging with the community before we come and present what an option might look like.
And I think that's why this particular policy is so important, that this is not a policy that could ever go on consent, or this is a policy that's going to require an actual presentation of, because it's easy for us. I mean, we have one audience member. it's easy for us because we discuss this all the time. So we understand what this means. As we've learned, the public reads the newspaper or Facebook and thinks we're excluding. Where I think if we have a full-blown presentation as we roll out this policy, I think it will give a better understanding to the public that what we really are trying to do is make this much more efficient and enable them to provide us much better data up front. And in no way excluding the opportunity that there may be multiple options, there may not, but they're going to be given a lot of opportunity to provide us feedback and input into the process, both here on the front end, and then even after we have developed an option or options. So I think like Ms. Galler's talking, communication is going to be key. I also think it's key that I would like to see it articulated within the process. I'd like to see some communication guidelines, requirements articulated in the process. Yeah, I kind of went back to, we make the assumption that because the board voted in October of 2022 on the parameters of a redistricting that the FNP chose not to pick up and publish in the paper, we just made the assumption, oh, the public knows. But then it was spring before the public, quote unquote, knew. I would like us to make it articulate immediately upon that first meeting before the board, where we come, the superintendent will provide a scope of work, that we outline that a Find Out First is going out. We're going to release a press release so that at the very first presentation that redistricting's coming, the public knows.
So that be articulated in 3.
So I would like that to be articulated early. I mean, wherever, but I would like us to articulate a communication plan to the public at the first hint that we're beginning the process.
So you're indicating to add some language under 3A?
I am,
Okay.
because that's when we're doing it. We're correct. We're doing that to board review, discussion, and approval prior to commencement of the study. So that's the first word the board gets. Staff is coming to the board and saying, necessary. Here's the parameters. Here's where we want to go. Right then, I think then we should have a communication strategy that sends out to the public to say, it's like often we send out a recap of the night's board discussion. I think this is an area where we should always say, last night on October 30th, the board discussed the beginning or the initiation of the whatever redistricting plan. And then we just articulate that we do that without hesitation every time.
If I could offer, if this meets your intent, Mr. Rose, actually put it under B with some sub-bullets to align with how we do it on some of the other paragraphs of this community engagement plan, and then these are the steps that will follow under B, if that's okay. But
that's fine with me, because I had one more caveat for B that might fall in that same vein, is that under B, if we articulate that, our communication plan to the community. And then it says, community engagement plans shall include a variety of engagement strategies emphasizing maximum community involvement and transparency. I'd actually like maybe some bullets there where we say to include, but not limited to.
So at a minimum, these
community forums,
Mhm.
online presentations, virtual forums, and surveys. So we're saying there's going to be all of these opportunities for you to provide feedback, and it won't be limited to this, but we are going to do these things. So I would appreciate adding that as well, so that the community knows how and when they're going to be engaged. I think everything we can do up front, communication wise, always helps us. And this will then obviously be part of our presentation when we bring this policy to the full board. And I hope the community, I mean, we actually received quite a few emails when they found out we were redoing policy 200. So I'm hoping when they find out this is going to be presented to the board for first reading, I'm hoping they watch, they come out, they comment, they, hoping they pay attention. Because I do think we're headed in the right direction. I appreciate Dr. Lebo's been great with his time, and he just talked about it, that we've spent a lot of time talking about this. And I agree wholeheartedly that this is a more efficient way to gain public input into the process. Like I said, we've seen it where people are just saying, I just like option A. But we want to know more. What do you like about A? Why couldn't we do B? So I think it's a better process. It's just making sure the community feels involved and communicating.
I have a couple of questions. Under definitions, is there a reason why we're only including those two definitions?
So those definitions are new to the policy. The current policy does not include definitions, and we felt like the policy needed something to articulate what was a child care center, because what immediately comes to mind, of course, is one of those commercial businesses that you drop your kid off at and they take care of your kid for the day. But that's not all that qualifies as a child care center. And so we wanted to articulate that it meant more than just the daycare down the street. And then in terms of specialized programs, again, there was no definition for what that meant, and we felt that it was important to incorporate a definition because we do have a number of specialized programs within our system that service the needs of our students, and we wanted to make sure that it was articulated this through the definition that we are going to be considering those programs as we are going through the redistricting process.
Well, I was just wondering why we didn't include, a definition of the total scope of redistricting, which would include elementary, middle, high school, and CTC. I don't know if and maybe other assets that are supported by the budget, just, because those are all affected by redistricting. I wasn't sure whether this policy, I certainly understand that it includes that scope, but does the public who reads this policy understand that it includes that scope?
So that may fit more into the policy statement than into as a definition, because I don't know that there is a specific term in the policy that we're defining there.
Yeah.
But it may maybe incorporate into the policy statement. And a policy statement does not necessarily have to be a single paragraph. It can be multiple paragraphs, each paragraph identifying a different piece of the, why this policy is important. And so a statement there articulating how this fits into the broader picture of all of the work that we do system-wide, I think that would make sense.
And I guess my other point too to that is that are there times, or my question is, are there times when only elementary schools are affected, or only middle schools, or only high schools? Some of the redistricting only affects, certain student populations.
It would be rare, and I'm struggling to even think of a time when it would exclude all levels,
Okay.
just because of the way that we're arranged, because
I see it as a domino effect kind of thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so typically it impacts, even if it's minimal impact, it typically has to impact
Okay.
the middle and high school as an example, even if we're opening an elementary school.
Okay, got it. And then the other, under attendance areas, I was just wondering if maybe the first part of A, the county shall divide into appropriate school attendance areas by the board, with the exception of some specialized programs. Students are expected to attend the school assigned based on their primary residence. And then that be, and the superintendent will prepare regulations concerning attendance areas. And that would be one paragraph. And then the next paragraph would be separated, addressing out-of-district placements. So that we would have that separate, not included in that there, because if the superintendent determines that the number of out-of-district students attending childcare centers, but isn't it go beyond just childcare centers? Does it go beyond, I mean, are there other incidences where the superintendent is looking and determining a number of students for elementary, middle, high school?
For the out of district.
Yeah, for out of district.
So I'm gonna look unexpectedly to Mike phone a friend to Mr. Falls, who actually knows our out of district regulations like the back of his hand. I guess the question is,
Set me up for failure.
there are instances when capacity is a driver for a denial, but there are always exceptions based on extenuating circumstances.
Correct. So we have three classifications of schools in the out-of-district process. There's underpopulated, that's under 75% capacity. There's restricted, which goes up to 95% capacity, and then there's closed. So under a closed school, which redistricted schools almost always fall into, there are very limited exceptions to the student being in a closed school. One of those considerations, and it only is a consideration, is to remain in a school that they're already enrolled. However, the regulations for redistricting excludes exceptions for those students who are out of district. And so we look at individual situations such as mental health, where there's a valid documented situation with students engaged in therapy, et cetera. So there are very limited exceptions, but there are exceptions that are allowed within the out-of-district.
So it isn't just contained to childcare centers. So the determination by the superintendent may affect a broader scope of students, not just the childcare centers. I guess that's my point, is that this seems so specific to childcare centers.
Well, I think the reason it is so specific is the intent is that we wouldn't want to do a redistricting purely because we're over capacity because of the enrollments from one or multiple childcare centers. The other ones that Mr. Falls are speaking to are really more one-offs, and so, but with a childcare center or potentially 2 or 3 large childcare centers within a close proximity, the board has said they don't want us to consider readjusting boundaries because a child care center is existing or will be built in the future. So I think that's why the language is in there specifically about enrollment pressures from a child care center. And I think that's part of the analysis that staff would do before we even really came to the board. Of course, if the board wants to remove that language, it's something we would evaluate differently. But we look annually at where the residences of students are and where their addresses, and where our out of districts are, and if they're creating any enrollment pressures at any single school. So
Okay.
it's helpful language from our perspective, but if you think it needs clarity, we can work on some revised languages to
I
explain
do.
why.
I'd appreciate that, only because I'm questioning this. I would think other people might question this particular statement.
And just a suggestion, one way maybe to break this out and then have an opportunity to clarify it is, would it be appropriate maybe to make that B?
Yes.
Have A is this, B is the impact of childcare centers, and then change B to C.
Mhm.
Because then we are talking about the 3, we're articulating 3 particularly
Areas that determine.
that could determine and impact the process.
Thank you. Thank you for articulating.
So I'm good on that section.
Yeah, that was it. That's all I have.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if it's appropriate in the process section or if we need to talk about it somewhere else. The Citizens Advisory Council had a really good discussion about this as a direct result from the meetings that have been in process and that discussion that eventually pushed this policy back to this committee. And I'm sure there's a way to kind of infuse some language back in to make the public aware and comfortable with the fact that obviously educating our children is our priority here. I mean, we're all here to do that. Yeah, running this large of an LEA, it's like running a business. It's absolutely a corporation. But when it reads like a corporation, that's where you get a little bit of alienation from your public. And the people that don't sit here, I mean, 6 months ago, I would have been like, policies, where are those? What do you mean policy, right? And so the way it reads, if you're coming in from out there and you don't know and you look at this, you don't see the underlying priority of SEPS is that we are here to educate our students. So that in mind, some of the things that came up were the consideration of mental health, the consideration of preserving the demographics of your community. And I'll just use, for example, this is what came up in our discussions too in our committee was, you have a large student population of English learners, right? So over time, that community of teachers and staff members in the school has kind of formed around supporting this community, right? And then if you redistrict and you take some of these kids out to a different community where this other community over here has not been formed around supporting them, it's going to be different for them. And I don't mean that, of course, there's going to be an emotional tie to where you are. I mean, I was very upset when I moved because I loved where I lived and I love my friends and our neighbors, and that's going to happen, and that's going to happen everywhere. But what needs to be addressed in the policy is more of the priority that we're going to do everything possible to maintain the quality of the educational services we're providing, whether you are in building A or building B. They were very concerned about maintaining that community and demographics came up a bunch of times because, I mean, as you know, schools throughout the county are extremely different. Populations are different. The culture is different. And can you make it the same from building A to building B? No, you can't, because it's not going to be the same. But the concern was the language needs to be included in here. Some of those qualitative things that maybe had been struck out, we need to infuse some of that language back in so that everybody understands and that the regulations and the processes that we engage in moving forward keep that priority of those students top of mind. And so that was an important conversation that we had from people from different areas. Some were very involved in the Crestwood process, and a lot of us weren't. So, but that was something that our committee really felt from the public feedback that we've been gathering. We want to see it in writing in the policy, which drives the process. So
would you want to see that under kind of policy purpose, or, it does address, some of what you spoke to with student demographic characteristics and all that in that statement, to expand upon that area in the policy, or incorporate language under the purpose?
I think it would be important to put it in both sections, to be honest with you. I think that is what pushed that dissatisfaction with the way it was written from the public, because they just didn't see that, those things, some of those things have been struck out, and we can reword it, but I think it's important to keep it in. I think it's important for our public when they're looking at anything that we have in writing that they know, we know it's in numbers. It's in one of my colleagues called it a butts and seats process. And it is. How many people do we have? How many seats do we have? I mean, it's a numbers. This is a numbers and budget game, and we understand, we know that. But to incorporate some of that qualitative part back in, just to say, we are going to look at the population, and we're going to look at the student support, and we're going to look at the processes that the students are in now, and how can we make sure that goes with them. And that's really important.
I'm wondering if it's more of a statement that we speak to that particular qualitative analysis that the board is responsible for these considerations. You know, when reviewing redistricting plans, because I know that when we did look at those plans, we did, I mean, that's how I thought of it, you know, when we heard the public speak, we took into consideration what we were hearing, the students who got up and spoke, and the impact that it would have on them and their education journey. And, you know, I mean, I know I can speak for myself, and I think a few other board members were feeling the same way, that, you know, that was some of what influenced the decision, you know, that we made. So I don't know, I don't have language for you, but I would, you know.
So it'd be okay, I think if we could come back with some of the revisions that we talked about and see if that hits what the policy committee is thinking. I think the one challenge, and it was right to Ms. Allen's initial point, is the reality is when any redistricting is going to change our school's culture, right? It is, because we're moving students out or in. And I don't know that you can't really, that's an unavoidable outcome. What the staff lens, and certainly, again, to the great work of Mr. Falls' teams in student services, is that's what they're really focused on. When the decision is made, how do we get the supports in place to make sure our students are adjusting, that they have all the resources that they need, and then likewise on the instructional side, if there's an instructional need, we sort of just need the decision to be made, so then all of those experts can get the work done of making sure the resources are in place to provide what our students need. So it is a difficult conversation, but the reality is we're moving students, and so that is going to change the composition of the school.
I think just what you said would be a good statement, you know, that, you know, we have an obligation or a responsibility to make sure, you know, as a board, to make sure that services are in place when students are moved.
And it's possible that some of the, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it is in there, that statement about the supports being under the factors.
And I think we can probably strengthen that.
Right.
Yes.
Probably strengthen
Agreed.
that, as well as in the policy statement, which I think we've talked a lot about how to maybe make that a little bit more robust in terms of how we're addressing the mental health needs, and educational welfare needs, and high quality educational programs. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a balance. It's always a balance, and redistricting, I think, is probably one of the things that brings out the most emotional responses, because people might, you know, have moved to a particular area for that school, people have built relationships, they know teachers, it's a difficult process.
Absolutely.
And when we have a school that's at 158% of capacity, we know that that's not the best educational situation for our teachers and staff or students. So it's a balance. But yeah, I mean, I guess as much as we can do to strengthen that language around caring for our students, I think will help.
May I suggest something? Sorry to speak up, but a consideration might be that you could make it clear that exigent circumstances can be addressed through the out-of-district process.
Mm.
So you're making the decision about the redistricting on the whole, but individual students who truly have legitimate hardships can be addressed through the out-of-district process.
Okay, good point.
I'm so glad you came.
How are we articulating? There was some considerations in this case around programming, and kind of goes along with that. How are we articulating, you know, when we talk about the out of district, say they were in Links and they get redistricted to a school without Links? How are we going to articulate that is important, or it just is part of the I mean,
Students who are attending those programs have exceptions already.
so they would,
That would be an exigent.
so that would be,
That we would consider. The so a student could go to Urbana, even though they're overpopulated, to participate in the IB program, because it's the only place we offer. And so there are exceptions that are already granted for those things.
Because there was the impression during this last that Link students would not be.
So I think we're talking about two separate pieces.
We're kind of talking about different programming.
So Mr. Falls is correct in his statement. The difference is when it's a whole school program like Links, which is different. I think some of the other programs like our engineering programs that
Leadership.
some of those were leadership,
ROTC,
those would be a different conversation because it's not the entire student population.
Correct.
I guess the challenge would be.
Links is such a unique animal.
Correct.
That one entered into this conversation around this particular redistricting.
Which is really a broader question of is that program going to expand? Because otherwise, I mean, Frederick High is an example, we could never redistrict Frederick High. It's-
Right. Or
It's a
we'd
consideration.
be overwhelmed with waivers because.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So we don't speak to that specifically. I think Mr. Fall's comment above captures the individual programs at our other schools, but it does not address Links because it is such a unique program.
That one gives me pause because it's like the elephant in the room. Like you said, every time Frederick gets involved in a redistricting, it's going to get brought up. Because some of our families and students have seen the value of that particular program. And if we're pulling 9th and 10th, in this case, we're showing that there could be some potential for 11th and 12th graders to remain, but 9th and 10th graders are not going to have that. We do introduce them to it in the 8th grade, so it is one of those kind of things. It's a tough one. I'm excited to see that we seem to be evolving at some of our other high schools, and we're incorporating some internship activities and some similar activities. And I have a lot of questions about how we might piggyback upon Link's experiences as far as field trips and things like that in other schools. But anyway, getting off topic.
That's a conversation for a different
Yeah,
place and time.
whole different topic. But I just wonder that is the one unique program we've got sitting out there. And because of where Frederick High is located, Frederick High could often be included in almost any redistricting discussion. So.
We have the IB program at Urbana, and that's the only IB program we have.
But not the entire school participates.
Right. And that's, you apply to the IB. And
I'll take that back to have a discussion. Actually, I'll recommend to Dr. Mason we have that as a cabinet discussion too. That's very.
yeah, it's just so unique. I just think it's something we need to discuss. And I just had one grammatical on 3D. The very first line, school system staff will then develop school attendance boundary options, plural. Should we change that to a school attendance boundary option? Because we use the word option continually. We're saying we're only going to possibly present one. Just don't want to leave that hanging out there.
Thank you.
Okay.
So Dr. Lebo, do you think you have enough feedback to?
I think we will have a robust conversation the next time we meet. I did want to add though, not, if at all possible, we need to move through this policy pretty quickly. We do have Valley on the horizon,
I
which
wish you hadn't said that. I hope you were going to say, we have plenty of
no,
time.
not
Efficiently and effectively.
Yes, let's do that.
correct,
Efficiently.
because I don't want us to get behind in the next one. We do have some time, but I don't just want to kind of, we all collectively agree that we have to kind of keep our.
So when would you be ready to come back to, because I'm just.
We will be
this
ready at the
needs to
next,
come back.
we will be
next
ready at the
policy
next
meeting.
policy. And if it's not ready, we'll come back again. I just asked that if we could possibly keep this as an item until
Oh,
we're
yeah, no,
satisfied.
This is
so
a
we can then
priority.
take it to
Yeah.
the board.
Yes.
It is already on the agenda for the next
For the
meeting.
policy.
There you go.
Great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Appreciate your hard work on this.
All right.
So that brings us to the bundle, 109, 305,
We never talked about this one before,
315, and 317. So
have we? A dozen times.
I'm going to dispense with 315 and 317 very quickly. We have, there's really,
Don't mind me, keep going.
there's really nothing to discuss on 315 and 317. Those are decommissions because the content is being incorporated into 305. They're just there because it is a part of the bundle. 109, actually, there isn't much to talk about either because I don't recall, and I didn't see in my notes, really any concerns by the board about what was incorporated into 109. I will share that I did hear back from the State Ethics Commission because as the panel requested, I did send them the draft of our policy, and they were comfortable with the changes we were making with one exception. They were not supportive of adding the crowdsourced monetary gifts, even though our colleagues in Frederick County at the Frederick County Ethics Commission have addressed this in an opinion. The state ethics panel came back and said, we're not ready for you to put that in there because that's not addressed in the statute. So we would not approve the policy if that remains in there. And I told them, well, I had told the board that that was something that they had to approve. And so that will come out when this gets re-presented for second reading.
So is that both number 9 and 10 or just 10?
Just number 10. They didn't say anything about number 9. And number 9 is consistent with the existing policy, which is you can't have more than $20 gifts. It just talks about aggregating $20 gifts by a number of people. And so it is still consistent with what is in the statute. It is just this crowdsourced gift idea that was not. And I encourage in my response back to the State Ethics Commission, I encourage them, well, this is something that's happening as evidenced by the Frederick County, the need for an advisory opinion from the Frederick County Ethics Commission. And this is only going to happen more. So you all ought to think about what you want to do with this because this is an issue. And you're not letting us address it, and that's fine. You want first crack at it, well, take your crack. Let's keep that. I encouraged them to do that.
And did they provide any context to?
It's outside. From their perspective, it's outside the scope of what's provided for in the law. It's not, and they have not yet addressed it. So they would rather, if the issue comes up and we cannot decide upon it, we request an advisory opinion from the State Ethics Commission, since it's not articulated by the what's in the legislation.
So this summer, when all these teachers are doing these crowdsourced requests.
Well, so then the question is around the relationship between board policy and our regulations, which are at the direction of the superintendent. And so if our internal procedures, we can continue to approach that. It may not have a policy anchor, but we
Right.
don't have to change what we're doing because we've established that's part of our process.
And this is focused specifically on crowdsourced monetary gifts.
Right, which
This
is
is-
not the Amazon wish list.
Gotcha.
It's not,
Monetary.
it's like all of you getting together to buy, Mr. Blair's a gift.
Or, and the circumstance that came up in the Frederick County advisory opinion, I believe it was the county executive's spouse who had passed away, and a bunch of people had gotten together to give her donations through the GoFundMe to help support her as she was, working through dealing with the loss of a loved one. Ultimately, my understanding is she ended up returning all of the gifts to everyone. She didn't keep any piece of it, even though the advisory opinion was that there were circumstances where she could. That's what this was intended to address. It's not intended to address the teacher wish list.
Yeah, it's not, shouldn't, our Amazon wish lists are
Gotcha. Okay.
fine.
Yay.
Yay for that, right?
Yes, I want to be clear about that.
So unless there are other comments or questions on 109, because it was sent back to the panel, but that doesn't mean it was sent back for any needed changes. It was sent back because it's a part of the bundle, because 109 and 305 go hand in hand. We can dispense with 109 and focus on 305.
Agreed.
I only had one question, but I don't have any real issues with anything that's here. I'm glad to see that actually that crowdsourcing is removed. To tell you the truth about that. And I was gonna ask for an example, but you already gave that, so that's great. Under definitions, under B, why is rental property or timeshare excluded as a declarative asset in the financial disclosures?
Which
It's
definition?
number 10, second
10.
home is defined to mean a residential property that an individual occupies for some portion of a filing year and is not a rental property or a timeshare.
So I think the reading of that is it's not a property I'm renting for a week. It's not me going and doing an Airbnb for a week. And a timeshare doesn't actually entitle me to ownership of the space. It's this weird construction where I'm buying access for a particular week, which can then be traded all over. And my family has them and I've never understood how or why, frankly. But it's not actually ownership of the property itself.
It's like a membership.
I get it. So I think I just was reading that differently. And, you know, that not a rental property that that board person was renting.
Right.
Yeah, I think
for
if it's a
specific period of time.
if it's a rental property that I own for the purposes of renting it out to the community, to someone in the
Yeah,
world who
right.
wants to come to my beach house for a week, that's different. That's an money making interest, and I think that would require declaration.
Okay. I just wanted clarification on it. Great.
So turning to 305, the focus for the board really came on those sections that we spent an awful lot of time talking about, and that clearly we did not do enough to satisfy the board's needs, and that's the tutoring and summer camps and the out of season activities. And so I am going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sergo, because this was really her area of work, and let her engage in the conversation with you all about how we want to address this. And again, we did not propose any language. We wanted to bring it to the policy committee first.
Right, and I'm gonna need some direction from the board because I think I was absent from the part of this conversation at the last board meeting. I think one of my children had a instrumental music concert that I had to attend, so I stepped out. And I don't know, Ms. Gallagher, could you summarize or sort of give me a sense of where the area of tension is so that we can address it?
So from my notes, it really focused more on the out of season activities
Okay.
than the tutoring and summer
Okay.
camps. At least that's what I had in my notes. And I think
Okay.
there was a request to look at the MPSSAA, regulations, policies, documents, to see if there was any language that they would recommend that would help bolster this.
So we pulled this from that, and
Okay.
Kevin Kendrow and Dan Lippy, who at the time was Mr.
Yeah.
Kendrow's supervisor, helped to write this language. So I know there's alignment. So are people looking for more restrictive language that's in the policy, or I think we sort of tried to strike a balance?
Yeah.
Because what I think we heard from the board was, first of all, we're not trying to dismantle the out of season activities infrastructure that's in Frederick County, but we also need to make sure that it's done in accordance with the MPSSA regulations. And so that's sort of where we landed. And I don't know, because I apologize for not being present. I don't know what made them feel like there was something missing.
So my notes
Yeah.
were really focused on two pieces. One, there was some concern that the summer athletic camps really, as much as we try and separate them and say you don't have to attend a summer athletic camp to be on a team, that if you're not participating in that summer athletic camp, your chances of making the team or being a leader on the team or a starter on the team goes down. And there was some real, very strong concern, strongly voiced concern from both Mr. J and the student member of the board about
Pressure.
that. ab-
It's called
about
pressure.
feeling pressure to participate. And so they were looking for stronger language on that
Okay.
piece of it. And then,
Okay.
well, then President Johnson, now just more board member Johnson, had also articulated some concern, and this may be a gap in what we have actually, about accessing instructors during the school year for extra non-athletic extracurricular activities. So the violin player who wants to get extra violin lessons from the orchestra,
They can't do that.
well, and that's I think what she wants addressed is.
Right, so you're saying that sort of broadening the language of tutoring to be tutoring and related assistance, or, right? So sort of, it's interesting because they're sort of both under the same notion that there's a boundary that has to be established that is a protection for students, but also for staff, right? Around this notion of undue pressure, right? So I tell you, if you use me as a tutor, you might feel I'm more likely to give you a good grade, or you feel a sense that I have to do this summer camp so that I'm more likely to select you for the team. And that's this sort of underscores why those boundaries are there, why this language is there to sort of reduce that sense or impression. So I think we could easily add some language that just frankly explicitly states that no student or staff member, frankly, should feel obligated to provide assistance, nor should any staff member use that participation to govern decisions about participation or grades. I think we can come up with something on both ends. Because I've also heard from employees who've said, a parent wants the teacher in their school who teaches a certain course to tutor their child, to help their child get into that course. So it's not, I don't want to suggest this is a responsibility that sits with families or with children. It's a collective responsibility, and that's there to establish those boundaries. I think we can add that language pretty easily.
And I think, we've talked about this a lot here.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the challenges with the out of season activities too
Mhm.
is like, where is our domain as a school system
Right.
to govern people's time when they're not currently active?
And that's sort of what we're trying to say here.
Right.
We don't, what you do on your personal time is your personal business. I think the issue I'm hearing is, how do we establish a more clear sense of where my time starts and stops, particularly when I'm doing in my own time the same thing I do in my employment, right?
Well, and with sports, I think in
Yeah.
particular, that pressure for students to participate in these out of season camps that are not facilitated by FCPS, but they are facilitated maybe by a coach.
Right,
You know,
right. So the
and
same
that
coach who does it
pressure
during the year is
to
doing it on their own time, right?
Right.
And I think everyone comes at this with good intent. I think all of our athletic coaches, like, they're committed to our kids. They're trying to serve them year round. They're trying to maintain their conditioning. I think it's just a matter of trying to help people say that if you feel pressure to do it, the board policy says you shouldn't. And here's your comfort. And certainly I think something to talk about in the regulation, if someone was to feel that they had an adverse impact because they didn't do something, I think we have a process to, investigate that, that exists. And we just make sure people feel comfortable and clear on what that is. So,
So, yeah, I think those two sections were the ones that maybe if we can strengthen the language.
yeah.
There was also, I had a note on the intellectual property, 10B, I think, and I don't know if this was, I think Mr. J was looking for generally more information on intellectual property rights for public employees. I don't know that he wanted it necessarily incorporated in the policy, but I think he wanted a better understanding of, for public employees, what are the IP expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I do recall I didn't take any notes because there was no action item that caught my attention coming out of that conversation, but I do recall having that conversation with Mr. J about the intellectual property, and ultimately what was conveyed was that this is actually giving more rights to employees than what currently exists in our intellectual property requirements. And as soon as he heard that, he was like, oh, now I understand this is better. How this is an improvement over what we have and will encourage our staff to engage in intellectual property pursuits.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I agree. So just for clarity, we'll add some language into those two spaces to address the concerns, and then will it come back here again, or do you want it to?
Yeah, it would have to come back
Come
here
back here,
because
okay.
we haven't had a chance to discuss what that language might be. So this will be on the agenda for the February 28th.
Great.
Policy
And,
committee.
We will have it ready for you.
Just to be clear on out-of-season activities or
Yeah.
trips, it's going to be a statement of support.
Of course.
I mean, it's not going to be a statement of restriction.
No. I think it's,
I just want to make sure.
Oh, absolutely,
Because I can already, you're going to get pushback comments from those board members that feel strongly about this issue, but this issue is not, it's an issue where we need to show support. But it's
Absolutely.
not an issue where it's our purview to restrict.
No, and I
Does that
think
make
that's
sense?
exactly, and we are not
Yeah.
going beyond what the MPSA requires. We are
Correct.
codifying
Correct.
what exists somewhere
Correct.
else in our policy.
Because I'll be totally upfront that I've engaged with MPSSAA over the years and was an advocate for
Yes.
relaxation of the rules that have been relaxed
Right.
for out-of-season activities.
We are just establishing
I
our
don't want us to
boundary.
go backwards
Mm-mm.
and restrict activities because of the emotional feelings of some.
No, we're not trying to restrict
I'll leave it at that.
activities. Yeah, we're trying to make sure that it's clear where FCPS starts and stops.
Yep.
As the employer, and to make sure that students and families understand that these out-of-season activities are separate from, and even if there are employees during the year, they are separate from their work as an employee. And so that, we're just trying to establish that clarity.
And this applies both academically and athletically. I mean,
Correct,
you know,
correct.
So,
And I think it's important in places other than athletics, because to your point, Ms.
Exactly.
Gallagher, it's tutoring, it's
Music instruction.
music instruction. We've created a category here, but it's sort of anything you're doing outside of your time. We have a lot of staff who teach courses at universities. And so, how do we make sure if we have a staff member who's teaching we have staff who teach in the graduate program at Mount St. Mary's or Hood, that they're doing that on their own time. They're receiving compensation from that employer through that exercise. And even if you're a student in their class, that's separate. And so I think we're going to make sure we do a really good job as we communicate this back with the policy committee and then the board to show that it's a broad brush across all of those scenarios, even if it's called out specifically.
yeah, then almost we're asking our employees to follow an ethical standard.
Right.
Yeah.
And to just help people see where those lines are.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
So I have a question. Do we remove the crowdsourced monetary gifts under gifts?
We will remove that from here as well, yes.
Yeah.
And did I hear that we're going to, or the regulation committee is going to develop an additional regulation around this? Or is it just the existing regulations that are noted on here?
So we don't have a regulation for the conflict of interest policy.
Right, because this is a new policy for
Right,
employees,
for the
so.
first time. I think it's an interesting question because regulations are sort of the operational implementation of a policy. And so I would want to have some time to talk with Mr. Blivis and Dr. Dyson, because a lot of, let's say, the implementation of this, I think lives in other regulations, like how we handle investigations, how we address concerns of policy violations. I don't know if this needs its own regulation.
Yeah.
Some do, some don't. We are developing the employee code of conduct, which I have been leading that effort. We have a draft. We've been working with our labor associations. We've taken it to the teachers advisory committee, the principals advisory committee. I'm currently building a compliance module, so every employee will have to interact with it before the first day of school. And so it's sort of the anchor for that, but sometimes I can clearly say, you know what, this needs a reg. I'm actually not sure about this.
Yeah, I'm not,
Yeah.
I know that I would think that we would need to go beyond the current regulations of donations and fundraising, but you
Yeah.
already mentioned, investigations.
Right.
Like when and you mentioned an incident that might happen if a student feels that there's adverse effects
Correct,
from not participating in something that was extracurricular
right.
outside of the school system.
And there may be a place in a current regulation where that can live, that it doesn't necessarily require the creation of a new regulation. And that's part of what the RRC, the Regulation Review Committee, is routinely doing, is looking at, how those changes need to be made. So for example, I mean, the IP, we were talking about the intellectual property, there is no current process for a meeting with the superintendent if you, as an employee, think you have a IP based project. Well, the board has directed the superintendent to create that, and that will be a new regulation because there's just nothing currently that, where that would live.
I think the interesting thing about this particular policy is because it's considered, the title is conflict of interest in employee ethics. Really, the notion where a regulation or implementation comes up is when there's a violation of this policy, right? So it's like, did you violate this? And so we have existing regulations that govern how we address violations of board policy. And so that the question is, does that regulation cover these concerns? For example, we know that if you have a question about ethics, there's an ethics panel. You can get an advisory opinion. So we're going to look more closely at that and see and let you know whether or not we end up developing the corresponding regulation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's no other questions on 305, what I will do is put this back on the agenda for February, but I'm only going to put 305 on because I don't see the purpose in listing 109 and the other two that are being decommissioned. We know that when this comes back to the board, they will come back as a bundle, but for the purposes of the policy committee, if it's all right, I'll just list 305 for the February meeting.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
So that brings us to the 400 series items. Now, at the December 13th meeting, we had actually discussed 400 series policies, 403, 404, 407, and 408. You'll only see that we have 2 of them here. That's because 403 and 408 we're still working on. We started it, we realized, Ms. Chesney, my paralegal, was doing some research related to it and we thought based on that research that some more work needed to be done. So those 2 will come on the February 28th agenda as well. We're not ready to present on them today. But I will ask Mr. Falls to join me at the table so he can talk about 404 because that is one of his areas, one of his many areas of expertise, as we've learned today. And so this is the first time it came up for information and discussion. And so we only talked about what you were looking for. So this is a true red and blue red line. And you'll see the changes that we are proposing, and I'll let Mr. Falls walk us through it.
Thanks. And thanks for setting me up again with the comment about the expertise. Appreciate that. You may recall from the last conversation, really the main substantive change to this policy has to do with how the student rights and responsibilities are communicated. Because we had a standalone document of student rights and responsibilities, and now they're incorporated into the parent-student handbook and code of conduct. And so that's really the substantive change. The rest are edits that happen with the reformatting. There are no other real major changes except all the notations that Mr. Blivis and his staff have done in linking it to policy and regulation.
The most extensive linking we've done so far. I feel like we could just link it to the policy and regulation page.
Yeah, and COMAR is clear that students have to be advised of their rights and responsibilities, and that's an annual obligation of the school system. So we've always accomplished that with a standalone document, but it does fit very well within the student code of conduct and parent-student handbook. So that really is the change.
I have 2 relatively small comments. One is just in terms of when annually should we be specifying it at the beginning of the school year or prior to the start of the school year? Is there any reason why we wouldn't do it at the start of the school year? Right now it just says annually. I don't know if specifying annually at the start of each school year.
No, there isn't any reason why not. I mean, we certainly could add that if you want that clarification. It is going to happen at the beginning of the school year because the code of conduct is covered every year at the beginning of the school year. But you could certainly codify that within the policy.
Maybe just the time frame.
Yeah.
And then-
Just say prior to the start of each school year.
Well, it would be at the beginning of the school year. So we might want to say within the first month of the school year, because they do a lot of sessions with students to go over the code of conduct. They don't just provide it to them. There's teaching about the code of conduct. So I would want to give them time to do that, maybe the first 2 weeks of the school year or something to that matter. 'Cause-
30 days.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You can be broad.
30
but
days.
First 30 days.
Articulate.
Yeah.
And then my other question was the parent-student handbook and student code of conduct that's linked and online still says draft on it. Is it still technically a draft or have we moved it? Is there a reason why it still says draft?
It is not a draft.
Okay.
And it's funny that you bring that up because in preparation of this meeting, I actually texted Dr. Loris Phillips to ask that question about why does that link still show up as draft? Because when you go to the document, it does not say draft. But when you Google it, it comes up as draft. So yes, I made the note of that and reached out to him to ask him if we could get that corrected.
Thank you. That was it.
Very
That's all I
observant.
had. That's all I had on this, so.
I had one, just a comment or a question of, do we want to include under section D implementation, the how? So you had indicated, the timing, which I thought was one of my questions, but also how that's going to be done. And you indicated that it is done through the classroom instruction, correct?
That is
It's
correct.
reviewed. So I just feel that if parents are reading this, they're going to understand that it has been introduced via the classroom to their student.
So what I wouldn't want to do is tie the hands of schools because some schools last year did some like grade level assemblies where they
Okay.
communicated that. Others, the administrators divided up the school and actually went class by class. Others, the school counselor was involved with that articulation within the class. So I don't know that I'd want to tie their hands unnecessarily as to how they do it within their school. But we could say that it would be covered through instruction and a provision of the.
Yeah,
of the
or, say, there may be various ways in which this is introduced to the student, through assemblies, counseling, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, that looks like the full gamut of all our policies.
It's a pretty long list there, yeah.
Comprehensive list. But I appreciate that. I appreciate this one-stop shop link.
Well, I mean, the
Thank you.
truth is student rights cover about every aspect of the
That's right.
student experience.
Yeah, so I appreciate the availability of this.
So if there's no other questions, with those changes that have been suggested, I think we can move this to the board for a first reading.
Agreed.
Okay. And then policy 107 or 407, if you recall, this was being brought as a decommission. The content of this is going to ultimately live in a regulation.
The attendance, right?
In the attendance
400-98.
regulation.
I can read what we proposed, because that was, I think some of what you had expressed was concern in regard to making it clear who can sign a student out of school, et cetera. So I can read to you the statement that we're proposing within the regulation that would really address that.
Wells, can you repeat the regulation number?
400-98, student attendance. And so what we're proposing, and that hasn't gone to the regulation
It's
committee
not.
yet, but what is being proposed is a statement that says no person shall be permitted to visit a child in school or remove a child from school or a school-sponsored activity without the approval of the principal or an individual authorized by the parent/guardian. So that, and again, that puts that in writing, which is standard practice anyway. We just don't dismiss kids to people that don't have the legal right to sign that child out. So, but I hope that kind of
Yeah,
covers.
I think it's
the
important to
concern.
articulate it though,
Yeah.
so I appreciate
Sure,
that.
yeah.
And then, I didn't see a note, Mr. Rivas, on the analysis form itself to
Reference
that
the,
references.
The regulation.
the
400-98.
regulation, yeah, which I think would be helpful if we are voting for decommission, that we reference where.
Sure. I mean, it just says it to a more appropriate regulation. It doesn't specify. We can revise the analysis form to articulate the specific regulation that the language is moving to.
Great question.
Yes.
Otherwise, great. Just saying that was there. And so will the updated language in the regulation doesn't necessarily have to wait for this policy to be decommissioned.
No, it can go into it will, hopefully it will be on the RRC agenda for the February 7th meeting, I think is the next RRC meeting.
And that's a simple change for that review process as well.
So then I will mark this as ready to move to the board for first reading for decommission as well. That brings us to the end of the agenda. Here's what I have on our list for the next meeting. I have 200 school attendance areas and redistricting coming back again. I have 305 conflict of interests and ethics, or employee conflict of interest and ethics, coming back with additional language. I have 403 student rights and responsibilities, which we talked about on December 13th. I have 408 suspension and expulsion, again discussed on December 13th. And that leaves us, at least for now, with some room to add some more 400 series policies that can come on either with language or for information and discussion purposes.
Does that?
Not all of them are yours, Mr. Falls.
Does that if we get through 403, 404, 407, and 408, does that conclude the first section of the 400 grouping that?
We had already established their priority.
Right.
Right,
I
let
had to
me
go back.
go
Can't remember
back.
which meeting that was that we looked at that.
I know we documented the
it-
priority listing of
It does not. The first grouping included three other policies: 437, bullying, harassment, and intimidation; 423, gang activity; and 439, dress code for students.
So that was 439.
439, dress code for students. Those don't date back quite as far as the first ones, but thematically and as a matter of subject, they seem to relate to the suspension and expulsion, student discipline, rights of students. They all seemed to tie together, which is why we bundled them the way they did, with the exception of dress code for students. That's on there because it's required to review every 2 years. That's a requirement already, and so we needed to get that back onto the agenda to make sure we're meeting that 2-year review process, and it was last reviewed in May of 22. So
are they scheduled?
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So Mr. Levis had sort of grouped the 400 series by theme and those
Age.
that had, and last review date, yes.
Yeah.
And so what we were trying to do was to take them in chunks. So we haven't looked at any of those three. Is it feasible for us to at least put them on for information discussion?
I think we can put them on for information discussion. I will talk with the individual subject matter area experts to see if they think they would be able to have language to propose. They will know whether there is something that needs to be changed language-wise. But it's always going to be open for, well, the panel wants to discuss another piece of it that they didn't. So let's talk about this other section and we can make edits and bring it back. So I'll talk with the subject matter experts to see whether we'll have language to propose or not.
That's great. And if not, if we can at least put them on for information
Yes.
discussion. I do think that these are three potentially policies that could raise some interest from the public. and
Yep.
the community.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So too.
Yep.
Want to make sure that we're having a good, bullying,
There's gonna be a,
and gang
Yes.
activity and dress
And-
code.
Yeah.
right, well,
Lots of
the-
raised-
those are three strong ones.
Yes, they
so.
are.
The dress
They're
code
important
issue
ones.
came up last graduation season.
And I hear it on a lot of visits to our high schools, so.
So if we can add those, that'll be a pretty robust meeting, it sounds like.
We will have a very full agenda, yes. But that's okay.
That's what we're here for,
Mhm.
right? And it's 11:05, so just ahead of schedule.
25 minutes of your day, back to you.
Anything else for the good of the policy committee?
Good, thank you.
All right, and if that's the case, then we will adjourn at 11:05.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.